Lagos has become one of the largest exporters of illegal ivory in the world.
Of a third world nation, where your votes will get stolen if you can vote there at all.
Welcome to Around the World with Dane Waters. I'm your host, Bruno Kaufmann. Oh, wait, that's my guest today, Bruno Kaufmann. So actually, he should be the host. He's a much better host than I ever would be. So, but anyway, welcome to Around the World with Dane Waters and your host, Dane Waters. So, a few things to go over before we get to our first guest here. Let's talk about what they call the Trump Retribution Tour, where he's going after his political opponents. Listen, if you have the power, some people just want to use that power, and so he's definitely using that power. You know, this week he's going after his former national security advisor, John Bolton, claiming that there's some violations, and he's kept classified documents. Oh, wait, Donald Trump did the same thing. You know, let's just forget that part, I guess. He's also going after members of the Federal Reserve. He's been trying to get rid of the Powell, who's the chair of the Federal Reserve, but hasn't really been able to find a way. So now he's slowly getting rid of each member of the Federal Reserve by firing them, which is the first time in the history, the 111-year history of the Federal Reserve, that a sitting president has tried to fire a member of the Federal Reserve, because it's supposedly supposed to be totally independent. But you know, we'll see how the courts work that out. Also, to continue about Trump, one thing that's interesting, and I think that this audience will find quite interesting as well, is, Donald Trump has really focused heavily on redoing the exhibits at the Smithsonian Institution. And the other day he came out and said that they need to take a very special look at the slavery exhibits, because he believes that the museums make slavery out to be worse than it actually was, which quite stunning in itself, that statement. So we'll see how that comes out. And the last thing we'll talk about is how Donald Trump is using his powers to bring out the National Guard. I was just recently in D.C. and with the National Guard there, trying to trying to deal with law and order issues. Listen, I lived in D.C. forever. I never really thought it was a problem, but now he's trying to put the National Guard in Chicago and into Illinois, which is interesting, because Governor Pritzker of Illinois and Rahm Emanuel, who's the former mayor of Chicago, are most likely political opponents on the Democratic side in the upcoming election. So I think there's something to say about why he's focusing on those areas. Anyway, so that's enough about Donald Trump, but now we have the whole world we need to talk about, because there's so much going on around the world about the threats to democracy, threats to freedom, what's going on in the war with Ukraine. So let's just take a quick break from Around the World with Dane Waters, and we'll be back with our first guest to talk about all those wonderful things. Thank you. Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. It's always a pleasure to be here each and every week. And I'm actually very honored today to have back with us Bruno Kaufmann. He's a journalist and a world affairs expert, and one of the smartest guys I know when it comes to the affairs around the world. So welcome, Bruno.
Thank you very much, Dane. Thanks for having me.
So let's, I have you for the entire show today, so I'm forewarning the audience, because we have the entire globe to talk about. We want to talk about the state of democracy, different things, just, with the threats, in your opinion, because you actually, listen, I travel a lot, but you travel a lot more than I do. So really, you have first-hand knowledge of what's going on around the world. So let's just start in Africa. It's a broad continent, of course. But what is your take on what's happening in Africa as far as democracy, freedom? Just give us your overview of Africa.
Yes, first I have to say I'm traveling a lot, maybe even more times on the road than you, but I'm much more on tracks than in the air, up in the air like you. So that's the big difference between you and me. But starting in Africa. I mean, Africa is really the big continent, you can say, of the future, of hope, of young people, of many innovations on one side. On the other side, of course, it's still also a continent where many things are not really well connected, where there are many conflicts going on which are not in the daily news. So there are many things happening there which we don't know so much about, and there are a lot of concerns. But again, also there are a lot of opportunities. And I would say looking into the different parts of Africa, you see in many parts you see a lot of positive developments. I mean, looking into countries like West African countries like the Ghana or Senegal, where really also people movements have contributed to improvements recently. We see developments in Southern Africa, starting in South Africa, but also in neighboring countries like Namibia, Botswana, Zambia, where democracies have been on the move. And then we also see, of course, many challenges in many other parts. But I would say it's really something which we need to become much more attentive to, because Africa is a continent where so many opportunities will lay ahead, and I'm very pleased to look forward to that. Also learning more myself, because as I'm a big rail traveler, Africa hasn't been so easy to me for me to travel around. But for instance, in a few weeks, I will travel to Botswana, which is the longest. Existing democracy in Africa, where you see a lot of these current global challenges evolving. I mean, Botswana is on one side a very well governed country, where they had the first change of party power last year, and it was an extremely peaceful change. I mean, within seconds after results were declared, the party, which was in power for 58 years, they just congratulated the opposition and wished them all good luck. And I think we should learn a lot from such a country.
Well, speaking of Botswana, so you are also, I don't know what your official title is these days, co-chair of the Global Forum on Modern Direct Democracy, or whatever your title is. But tell us what's happening in Botswana next year as far as democracy is concerned.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I was one of the founders of this forum, which started in 2008, and which intended to bring together people who are looking beyond just simple representative government, looking into really participation and direct democracy on the local, regional, and national level, and also the international level. And this forum has visited all continents since 2008. We had one forum in Africa, in Northern Africa, in Tunisia in 2015, and now we will have the first forum next year in Southern Africa, in Botswana. And I'm now simply part of the steering committee, but I'm not anymore the president or the co-president of this forum. This is now shared between the international consortium and also a local host. And we plan now next year to have this forum in Gaborone, Botswana, to really address the issue of democracy in this part of the world, which is about good governance, but also about the local level and the regional level of participation. Botswana has a long history of local assemblies, the so-called kotlas, where people really meet to discuss about all important issues, and which are able to make decisions on the local level, but also advise to the national parliament. So the chiefs of the Kotla, which is in a way the old tradition of making decisions in this part of the world, to the modern ways of representative government, this bridge is still existing, and I think we can learn from that. But also the University, for instance, of Botswana is a very interesting place for development of regional and local governance in Africa, and they will be one of the co-hosts. So this year, in the end of September, we hope to announce the dates of the forum next year.
Well, it's great. Well, listen, I would encourage all the people watching this show, especially those in Africa, that it's hard to believe it was 2015 that we were in Tunisia. We're definitely getting older, but I think that everyone should participate in this, because it's a great opportunity to learn about democracy, the tools of democracy, and how because democracy is under assault in Africa in many places, in my opinion, especially in West Africa. Even there's some highlights. More coups have taken place on the continent than any other continent in the world. So we just need to follow as much as we can and help promote democracy in Africa as best we can. Well, let's move on, because well, let me ask you one quick question. I'm going to throw you a little curveball here. You do a lot of work around the world, of course, as we talk about. I was in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, not too long ago, where they were talking about the African Union was meeting, and they were talking about the whole issue of restitution from the globe, about when it comes to slavery. What is your take on that? I mean, what are you hearing around the world, especially from European countries? Is that an issue that resonates with people, in your opinion, that has any ability to move forward?
I think it's an important conversation, but at the same time, of course, a very difficult one because it's all about today's possibilities of developing economically and politically, and just thinking about getting back money as such is, of course, a very difficult conversation in many contexts today. But I feel it's important still to look into this issue of the damages which have been made through the colonial powers. And we see, for instance, now there is a form of restitution happening in countries like Mali, where the French are pressed out as, let's say, the local police force for so many years. And there is a new quality in discussing post-colonial and future-based governance in this part. And there is, of course, as in many places nowadays, when we see a change from a more unipolar one hegemon running to a more multipolar governance system, there is something like a vacuum which can be filled, of course, of bad forces, as we have seen, for instance, Russian mercenaries in countries like Mali or Central African Republic. So there's a big risk that this kind of conversation also opens up to this kind of let's say, of vacuums and bad forces. So we need to discuss how can these countries, how can the societies themselves become much more resilient, how much more powerful in governing themselves on a basis which are in the interest of the people. And this is a other big challenge because we have seen in many countries in Africa, dictators, authoritarian leaderships basically kidnapping the country and their economy and have no possibility to develop the people themselves.
Well, let's move on to Asia because one thing we see in Africa, because it kind of parlays, is that China is making huge investments globally. As America has pulled out of what I consider their responsibility globally, China has been backfilling that because with the power of the purse. So, what do you think about China and as far as China's global development? Do you believe that? I mean, some of these questions may be a little uncomfortable, but do you believe China is a threat to the globe? Do you think that they are filling an important void left by America, or do you think it's in a positive way or it's nefarious?
I mean, every big power can be a threat. I mean, we know that also about American role in the world. In many places, America hasn't played a very positive role in conflicts, in solving regime changes. So there is a clear risk of a country feeling that it has the power to influence in a way based on only its own will. But at the same time, it's of course also important to see that international cooperation is important. We have seen that in the US aid situation, for instance, in many places. But at the other side, also Africa has become a place where this struggle has been very, very obvious. And you see China has had a big influence in many places. At the same time, doesn't really have this kind of questions about human rights, about social responsibility. So China has had an influence which is beneficial economically, but not necessarily beneficial for the government and the freedoms in a country. Sorry. And I would say that China is in a very, very, let's say, sensitive situation now, because as we all know, after the COVID crisis, China hasn't been able to really recover. So it can really fill all these gaps which are now opened up through the US and the US government at this point with its own really extensive economic powers. China is in a situation where also the governance in itself is in question, because we know there is a president who is now in its third term, which is unseen under modern times and which is questioned in many ways. So it's very unsure how this regime in China will develop further. If a weaker China is more of a risk to others or more of an opportunity. The others, it's a little bit unclear because, of course, you can also always see that this nationalistic card can be played in a situation of crisis, and this may influence also the neighbors of China in Asia. As the most, of course, imminent example, Taiwan is always, let's say, a situation where you can test a little bit in which way China is dealing with other countries, even if China doesn't see Taiwan as another country. So there are risks, there are opportunities, and we have to be very attentive about what the development is in China. And still, of course, I also think it's important to have a conversation, especially with non-governmental forces in China, even if this is more difficult today than it has been in the last, let's say, 20 years.
Well, let's talk about the fact that the world, part of the show we call it the New World Order. In my opinion, personally, you have good. I always talk about good versus evil. Some people don't like talking in those terms, but you get what I consider evil. Once again, my own personal opinion about evil being China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran together. And then you get the good, which is what I consider democratic and democracy and freedom-loving countries. And continents like Africa are going to get to the point where they're having to be, choose between the two, economic resilience and economic support from China, America pulling out. But the EU, for example, you're a European citizen. America pulls out, China's backfilling. Why doesn't the European Union take a more active role in kind of filling the vacuum of America pulling out globally?
That's certainly something which is happening every day, you can say, but it isn't expressed as a government of a nation state would do it. Europe is a 27 country union which has its own differences within, where long and big traditions of nation states with important, let's say, narratives about the big nation of France, the British idea, where you have Italy, where you have Germany, and also, the Nordic countries playing an important international role. So for the EU, it's always like a complementary role in playing this kind of role, which otherwise big powers like the US, like China, but also in a way Russia wants to play. So we have to look beyond this kind of simple idea of good and evil, because in every place, in every region, there are different kind of stakeholders and actors. And I was just recently visiting and traveling across the United States, and I was surprised again how many, let's say, good forces, good governance elements, good local people are there in the United States who are not at all in this kind of let's say, total polarity, who try to bring together common sense, who try to make good services for their people. So you have that also in places even like China, still on the local and regional level as well. So we have still to continue to see and to identify this kind of partners for the good causes, which are, of course, freedom and democracy, human rights, and a good economic development, and not just about dominance, about big powers playing against each another.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I talk about, once again, good versus evil, and I put China, Russia, Iran, but within those countries. I have a lot of Chinese friends. I have Russian friends. I have, North Korean friends. Well, no, I seriously have no North Korean friends. I don't think I've ever met a North Korean in my life. But you're right. Broadly, when I have these conversations, I talk about more at the governmental level, the philosophical level of the government. But I think it is very important, as you say, to point out that it's not about the Chinese as individuals. It's not about the Russians as individuals. It's about the leadership within these countries. Because many people would argue, and exactly what you're saying in America, many people may argue that the current president of the United States might fall into the bad category, but Americans, there are a lot of great Americans out there as well. So every country has their good
You are
people
one
and
of
their
them.
bad people.
You are one of them.
You're very kind. Very kind. So let's talk about, since we're talking about the European Union, let's talk about the war between Russia and Ukraine. What is your take on that? As a European, Do you see that the Europeans have a greater responsibility to protect Ukraine, or walk us through that and your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's the time really for Europe to stand up. I mean, already in 1989, 1990, when this good opportunity of Europe reunification, German reunification came up, I felt that there is a need of a more European responsibility for its security. There is a need, in fact, for a common European security defense policy, and it wasn't possible at that time. It was also very much still played into the idea that there is one hegemon, the United States, which is running all these policing issues. And I would say this is now really the big second reminder that Europe has to become its own base for this kind of fundamental task. And what's going on in the Ukraine is absolutely a challenge to all the former ideas of how to organize itself. And it also reminds us that there is always also a big risk of a setback. I mean, Russia has never really experienced a true democratic phase, while many other, let's say, former Soviet republics have had that before, including the Ukraine, and where you also see that the people and the civil society really builds their the force, their resilience on this experience from former times, and where you see, I mean, you have recently visited also Estonia, which is the most successful former Soviet republic, where you really had a new generation of leaders coming up instantly after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and where it was possible to build a modern, free, and democratic state on the base still of the experience, of course, which was between the first independence in 1918 and then the occupation, the reoccupation of the Estonia and the Baltic countries in 1940. So what we see now is that these values of the European Union, these values of free countries reuniting in a common union, needs to be complemented with countries like the Ukraine, but also like other countries like Moldova, Western Balkan. I mean, Europe has to make a next phase of organizing itself to find its way forward, and it's a good chance. And I see many people really committing to that. I will be just next week. I will visit the northern part of Norway at the border to Russia, which is a very interesting place because it was the, let's say, the first direct border between NATO and Soviet Union, and it has had a certain openness because northern Norway was never really occupied by Russia. There was never a war with Norway in historical sense. So the Norwegians in northern Norway were always very open and positive to Russia and to the Russian neighbors. There were even, in a few years ago, there was a zone between Russia and Norway where you didn't have to have a visa. But in the last 10 years, especially after the Crimea annexation, Russia started to use northern Norway as a test ground for their hybrid warfare. And we see there now really a very intense place of how the developments, how the relations between also Europe and Russia will develop.
Very interesting. Well, listen, we're going to come back to that. Let's take a quick break from Around the World with Dane Waters, and we'll come back with Bruno and talk more about what's happening around the world. Thank you. Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. You know, Bruno and I were talking during the break there. We've solved all the world's problems, so we can just stop this show now. We don't need to go any further since we have all the answers to everything. I wish that was the case.
Yeah, I would like to have your optimism.
Yeah. Well, you know, the world, you know, there's one thing about people, human beings, they're resilient. I mean, it's just like they are resilient. And even though we as a human race are very self-destructive, we're also very resilient in many ways. And I do believe that as the world, just my personal opinion as always, is just as we get closer to the precipice, I think the best in humankind will come forward, and I hope that it will stop us from crossing over into the precipice. A quick question for you. You know, I've known you for a very, very long time, and you know, one thing that in your early days when you were a young whippersnapper, you were you know, when you were in Switzerland, you kind of worked anti-military, the military establishment, or however you want to call it. But as the world becomes more divided, I mean, you see that the growth of military, and we were just talking about the EU. Do you believe now that there is a need for a growth in the military machine or apparatus in like the European Union to protect against the nations of like Russia?
I don't believe in that this is a solution to invest a lot of money and much more into the military. I mean, we told before about the situation in 1989, 1990. It was a time where I was becoming really an active journalist, observer, but also a citizen in a way. And this hopes that this time of high militarization is over. And obviously it's not. And it's clear that today, I mean, there needs to be protection, there needs to be security guarantees in many ways. But with every billion invested in the military, we not necessarily get into that, because what's creating peace? Peace is when there is dialogue, when there is respect, when there is a way forward to peace, and this is not done by the military in itself. So having just the idea that by investing all our available resources into the military, we will certainly not get into a more peaceful world. And there are, in contrary, there are many risks related to this business, because it's also a business full of corruption, full of criminal actors. So there is to be an attention to that. But again, also like in those years then when we discussed the need and existence of national armies in many places, I feel there needs to be collective security arrangements. And I was already at that time more of a proponent of having, for instance, a European-wide defense force. And as we said before, also, I think there is an opportunity to create that today.
Well, listen, not to go back to Nigeria, because we talked about moving to other parts of the world, but you see what's happening in Africa with Boko Haram. You have terrorist organizations that just are very hard to get rid of. They're kind of, I hate to say it, but they're kind of like cockroaches. They just can't get rid of them. But in countries like Nigeria, you need a strong military, right, in order to fight internal dissent. You forget cross-border wars, but in situations like that, there's no way. Boko Haram doesn't care about dialogue. The only way to defeat them, I would argue, would be militarily. I mean, how do you feel about terrorist organizations and the need to defeat them militarily?
I mean, there's no single military solution to that neither. I think these kind of terrorist organizations also are based that there is always a continuous base of people being ready or being forced to be part of them and becoming like dependent on them. So there is always a comprehensive a way and need to look into how can we fix that. I mean, the counter-violence, the police or military is certainly one part of the solution, but not the only solution. That's really the message I want to give. It's much more important to look also long term into taking away the basis of this kind of terrorist activities and the like the possibility that they can recruit people for them, because it's about, of course, then people who feel that that's the only option for them into the future.
Okay, well, I'm going to now I'm going to jump over to the Middle East and tie into what's happening in between in Gaza with Hamas. I've had several guests on this show who represents the IDF and Israel and others, and it's been a mixed bag. Sometimes when I talk about Palestinians and how much that I am opposed to the death and destruction of innocent Palestinians, I'm labeled anti-Semitic. Other times I'm not. It's a hit or miss. But let's talk about what's happening between Israel and Gaza. What's your take on that?
It's a total catastrophe, and I mean it's a continuation of the catastrophes of historical means since, you can say, the Holocaust and the establishment of the Israel state, which is based on the idea that there needs to be like an answer. I mean, a continuous answer to to single out a certain nation and also a religion to be protected for good reasons, but at the same time see this in conflict with all the others. And what we see is also, of course, the failure of the international community to allow the Palestinians to have their own place to really stay and to arrange for them. I mean, we have seen these divisions for so long time and this basis of war. And what we see now is a total catastrophe, also a failure of the international community. And seeing this and following this, I mean, on an everyday basis, seeing people being attacked, being singled out to be like collaborators of the terrorists, everybody in Gaza. This is just not acceptable. And I think it's really time to stand up again for the international community, but also for Europe vis-a-vis Israel, that this is not acceptable.
Well, it's interesting, with all these global conflicts going on, it used to be that you would hear, the UN Secretary General Guterres saying something and being quoted, but honestly, lately you hardly ever hear about the United Nations and what's going on. What's your take on the UN? Do you think that they've outlived their usefulness? Do you think they have a place in global peace?
Absolutely. I mean, the UN is of course, I mean, there is a need of this kind of global organization. I mean, we have had that between the world wars with the Nation Association in Geneva, and we have it with the UN. But how the UN works, how the UN is funded, how the UN can operate, this is of course totally dysfunctional today. And we see a big crisis for this kind of international organization. What we would need is, in fact, a democratization, a reinvention of the United Nations. Maybe it will be called differently because in the future, maybe it's not the United Nations, but the United People or the United Regions of the world which needs to cooperate. But it's also what we experience today is, of course, the end of a time where you had this kind of just one nation, one voice. We need voices of many more. And there are initiatives like the World Citizen Initiative, which wants to increase the possibilities of people and citizens to influence also this kind of global organization. And it will be very interesting to see how this, let's say, reinvention can be shaped. What is the tragedy of our times and of history is, of course, that you always first need this kind of catastrophes. We see now in the Ukraine, we see it in Gaza, to evolve so that the unbound, the uncontrolled violence first creating so much damage before the community of countries, of societies really are able to find new solutions.
Listen, we have so much to talk about, but let's just go into, because we have like 5 minutes left. I do want to talk about, as we're talking about, we didn't get to, well, let's just give me 1 minute overview. We have to make sure we get South America. Give me a 1 minute overview about your take on South America and what's happening there.
Yeah, man, South America is again also in a very interesting phase of its development because we have seen this democratization in the 1980s and 90s, and then we have set all these setbacks starting in Venezuela, going down to Argentina, seeing Brazil on the brink of autocratic rule, and of course also many times these kind of criminal businesses going around. But recently also we have seen that people just don't go for the single ideological side, like in Bolivia, where the leftist government now has really lost its legitimacy, and people want to have a more democratic-based government. So I see in Latin America good hopes that the people are standing up for their rights, and there are also good examples, of course, of countries like Uruguay, but also improvements in Chile, sometimes also in Peru, where you see hopes for a better future. And I'm quite positive about the projections and the opportunities also for South America.
Okay, well, we'll come back to, because I have some questions specific about that, but I don't want to run out of time since you are very knowledgeable about the Nobel Peace Prize process. And there's been a lot of talk about Donald Trump trying to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And can you kind of walk the audience through exactly what is the process? How does somebody win the Nobel Peace Prize, and how does that process work?
Yes, it's funny to see that that Mr. Trump is so interested in that, and it's of course in a way it shows also the the renommee of this prize is so high, which is a prize which has been given out since 1901. So next year it will be 125 years, and it's based on the idea of Alfred Nobel, which was a Swedish industrialist, which invented the dynamite, which had bad conscience about the wars which the dynamite would create. So he gave all his wealth to this kind of prizes, not only for peace, but also for other science inventions. But the Peace Prize is the most political prize. It has been given since 1901, and it has had an interesting, let's say, resilience in trying to be a mirror of what's going on in the world, because it's not just about creating peace, it's also about human rights, it's about environmental protection, it's about international organizations. So becoming a Peace Prize winner, you need to be nominated first. And everybody who's in a parliament, who is a professor at university, who has been a prize winner before, can nominate somebody. This year there were 350 individuals nominated and about 100 organizations. So it's a big amount of possible winners. And then the committee, which is a committee of 5, which has been selected by the Norwegian parliament, but which are not necessarily politicians, but in a way mirroring the political composition of the parliament in Norway. They are selecting that. They have a lot of people helping them. They make a short list. And now in September, there will be the final, let's say, choices. And it will be very interesting to see if this year's Peace Prize will be a classical Peace Prize about, let's say, somebody who is really helping to create peace. Mr. Trump thinks he does that, but many people would say also all these conflicts he's addressing with this aren't really solved. So we will see. Maybe it will be more of a prize regarding climate protection. It could be. It could also be an international organization which for many years fighted, let's say, against the problems about human rights. Or it could be like last year, somebody who works with nuclear non-proliferation. It was a Japanese organization. So it will be very interesting. The announcement will be on October 12th this year, and the prize is always given on the death day of Alfred Nobel, which is December 10 in the City Hall of Oslo.
Well, we'll see what comes out. I mean, it's I remember how many. Do you happen to know off the top of your head how many U.S. presidents have won the Nobel Peace Prize? I know Barack Obama has.
Yes, I mean the first one was Mr. Truman, already in the zeros. We have had then a long break. Jimmy Carter got the prize. Also, you said Barack Obama. So Woodrow Wilson got the prize after the First World War. So there has been a series of American presidents who got the prize. Barack Obama's prize in 2009 was really a prize which many people, even himself, thought it wasn't deserved at this point, because it was mainly based on his promises and not what was really solved.
Mm-hmm. Well, listen, Bruno, sadly, we must go. It's always a great pleasure to see you around the world, and I hope to have you on the show again soon. Your insight's always very amazing and insightful, so thank you very much. Thank you for joining Dane Waters with Around the World with Dane Waters. It's always a pleasure to be here, and we look forward to talking to you again next week. Thank you very much.